Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to David M. Rubenstein, The American Story, Conversations with Master Historians in Conversation with Rita Braver. It is my pleasure to introduce you to tonight's host. She is a national correspondent for CBS Sunday Morning, reporting on everything from arts and culture to politics and foreign policy. A 9-time National Emmy Award winner, she has received the Joan Barone Award from the Congressional Radio and Television Correspondents Association, as well as the Star Award from American Women in Radio and Television. She's a longtime supporter of the Kennedy Center, and we are thrilled to have her here tonight. Please join me in welcoming to the stage Rita Braver.
Thank you all so much for coming. We're glad that this is early so you can hit the bars in Georgetown. It is such a pleasure to welcome my long-time friend, David Rubenstein, who I first met when we were both very young. He was working in the Carter administration. I was covering it, and I'm going to make him come up here and hear all the nice things I'm going to say about him. I have a feeling that you already know a lot about David. That's why you're here. But I want to talk about the amazing list of his good works. He is, of course, the longtime chairman of the Kennedy Center, and it is really, in large part, due to David that we are in this beautiful space today. He really spearheaded the building of the Reach, and with our good friend Deborah Rudder, who is the president of the center and who's here somewhere, they made this happen for the whole city, and we really have you to thank.
Thank you very much.
David has also served as chairman of the board of Lincoln Center. We don't like when you spend time in New York. He has given money to the National Parks Foundation, the National Zoo. He is on the Council of Foreign Relations. He's a trustee of the National Gallery. He's a trustee of the University of Chicago. He's a fellow of the Harvard Corporation, where he didn't even go to school. He's president of the Economic Club of Washington. So no surprise that he's a winner of the Carnegie Medal of Philanthropy. He has also, as a lot of you probably know, helped restore the Washington Monument after the 2011 earthquake. He's helping with the restoration of Montpelier, the James Madison Home, and he supports many other worthy educational, health, cultural institutions. He has also bought many important historical documents and made sure that they are on display so Americans can see them. He is a proud grandfather, and of course we are here because David has just published The American Story. And I brought my ragged copy here because I want to show you all the underlining, because that's how many interesting things and tidbits I found in this wonderful book. I should mention here that my husband, Robert Barnett, was his lawyer on the project, which just shows what good judgment you have. And in typical David style, any proceeds of the book are going to the Library of Congress, right?
They're going to the Literacy Fund, but it also shows what good judgment you have. So you've been married 48 years?
That's correct, but we're interviewing you, so don't start that. And my first question to you after all that is, when do you sleep?
Sleep is overrated, but no, I gotten very lucky, and I've been able to do some things that I wanted to do because my business took off much more than I thought it would, so it gave me the resources and time to do more than I had thought I would be able to do when I was much younger, for sure.
Well, we're going to talk about some of that, and I want to start, we're going to talk about the book, but I know a lot of you are here because David is such an interesting and frankly such a private person, so we're going to try to get a little bit of the man behind the book. Okay. You grew up in Baltimore.
I did.
Tell me a little bit about your parents. I had a chance to meet them, but I don't think most people don't know about your background.
Well, I grew up in Baltimore. Baltimore, when I was growing up in the 1950s and 60s, was the most rigidly segregated city by religion in the United States because the mortgages forbade you to sell a home to somebody who was black or Jewish, so even though that was against the law, Baltimore didn't quite get the word. So they still didn't really let people who were Jewish live in certain areas. So the Jewish community in Baltimore all lived in one little area, pretty much. And my parents were not college or high school graduates. My father dropped out of high school to go into World War II, came back, he met my mother. He was 20 when he got married, she was 17. I was born more than 9 months later, and I was the only child. And when you grow up you're the only child. My father worked in the post office. He made $7,000 or $8,000 a year, very modest income. So in hindsight, it was a great advantage, because when you grow up with the unconditional love of two parents, there's nothing more you really need in life. But in addition to that, I realized then that I had to do something on my own if I was going to get anywhere in the world. My own 3 children, they all have done very impressive things, but whatever they do, people will say, well, your father was a wealthy person, and therefore he helped you in some way. So when when you grow up in a wealthy setting, you also have the challenge of growing with wealth. As all of us know, if you have children who are growing up in a wealthy setting, they can do things that you might not want them to do. So it's a more complicated thing than what I experienced. At the time, I wished I had more wealth, or my parents were wealthy, or my parents were more prominent. But in hindsight, it was a great thing, because I had to do it on my own, and it was something that helped me later in life.
Is it true that you called your mom every day, even as an adult? It's what every Jewish mother wants to hear.
Well, when you are a young teenager, you're probably not thinking you're going to call your mother every day, and I honestly did not. When I went to college, I didn't have much money. I got a scholarship to go to Duke. It was not a basketball scholarship, I assure you. And I got cut from an intramural basketball team at Duke, which is hard to do.
So sad.
When there are only 4 other people on the team, too. So, some of you may be my age, may remember this. I would call my parents once a week. It was payphones. People remember what a payphone is? You put quarters in, and so I would, get like 8 quarters and put them in. You get 3 minutes on a Sunday. It was cheaper. So I'd call them for 2 minutes. 3 minutes, I would talk to my parents. My parents, they retired after I stayed in Washington while. They retired when they could. My father was retired when he was 55 years old, which is what you could do as a blue-collar worker working for the post office. So they moved to a suburb of Baltimore called West Palm Beach, Florida. And they moved down there, and then so they were spending most of their rest of their life down there. But when my father died at the age of 85, my mother was then about 82 or so, and I just resolved that she was living alone, that I would call her every single night. And so I did. For the rest of her remaining 5 years of her life, I called her every single night. And actually, I wished I had done it earlier, to talk to her more frequently than I had. I waited till my father died because I thought she was, didn't have a partner then. But it was a great thing. I'm sure my children will someday want to call me someday. At the moment, mostly I'm calling them. I don't get that many calls unless it's a call like, Dad, how are you doing? Fine. Could you send some money for this or something like that? But no, I'm kidding. But generally, kids don't call as much as maybe they should.
What did your parents make of your success? Because I know how generous you were to them, and I also know that you frequently brought them to things so they could be part of it.
Well, the strongest magnetic force in the universe is not nuclear energy. It is the love of a mother for a son when they're Jewish, right? So, my mother, when there were, is that right? So when my mother would, when there would be an article written about me, I would send it to, or my office would send it to my mother, and she would call me and she said, David, I've read it 10 times. I said, well, it doesn't change after the first time. It's the same article. But unfortunately, she just loved reading these articles, and so I sent them to her. My office would send them to her. When she died, I went through, and she had every single letter I had ever written her from the time I was a teenager. Had them all, every article ever written about me, cataloged and everything. It's just unbelievable. It's that she read these things over. So making your parents proud, I think, is one of the greatest pleasures in life, and I hope my children want to do that as well. But they are. And so it was a very good relationship between my parents and me, and sadly my parents passed away a few years ago. They lived to their mid-80s, and I hope I can make it that long myself.
You, as you mentioned, you went to Duke, you went to the University of Chicago Law School. You worked on the Hill. When I first met you, you were the deputy domestic advisor in the Carter administration. What did you learn from your government experience besides the fact that you didn't want to stay in it?
Well, the thing I learned is that, as Harry Truman said, if you want a friend in Washington, get a dog. Because when I worked in the White House, I was 27 years old. How did I get the job? Well, I had worked in the campaign for Jimmy Carter. And I didn't know Jimmy Carter from a hole in the wall. I was hired by Stuart Eisenstadt to work in the campaign, the general election. And when I started, Carter was 33 points ahead of Gerald Ford. When I was finished with my work, Carter won by 1 point. So it wasn't clear that my contribution was that great, but as we have observed, people who work in campaigns often get White House jobs. So I was 3 years out of law school, I became the Deputy Domestic Policy Advisor, an office in the West Wing. People coming and tell me how great I am. I got to spend time with Carter, cabinet officers, and it was fun. I worked around the clock. I loved it. But people would come to me and say, well, you're a bright young man. We want to hire you when you want to get a job. Well, I said, look, I'm going to serve in the second Carter term as the senior advisor, and so I'm not leaving, so don't bother me with job offers. The day after we lost the election to Ronald Reagan, I called all those people, and none of them ever called back. But be careful what you wish for, because I wanted to run against Ronald Reagan. I said, dear God, please let us run against Ronald Reagan. He is so old, he can't get out of bed in the morning, I'm sure. He's 69 years old. How can he possibly get up in the morning? I'm now 70, so I now think that it's like a teenager to be 69 or 70. But we didn't think we could lose to him, and we did. And in the end, it turned out to work out okay, because I had to go back and practice law. And then I realized relatively quickly what a bad lawyer I was as I got out of that.
You know, as you mentioned, you founded this very successful private equity firm, the Carlyle Group. Where did the name for the Carlyle Group come up?
One of my partners at the time when we started, originally we were going to call it the International Financial Advisory Investment Firm, or something that didn't make any sense. And we went through all the usual Greek names, which we couldn't pronounce, and the Roman names, we didn't understand what they meant. So we were looking for a name, and my partner had read a book about a man named Andre Mayer. He was running Lazard Frères, and he was a single man living in the Carlyle Hotel, having let's say, an active social life. And one of my partners aspired to live in the Carlyle Hotel with an active social life, so he thought that, it would be a good name, and so we named it after them.
One of my favorite exchanges in the book is when you're talking with Walter Isaacson about Benjamin Franklin's early poverty. And as you mentioned earlier, you say to Walter, I was poor once too. And I wondered if that memory of being rich is one of the things that led you into wanting to be philanthropic and knowing at an early age that if you ever did have money, you wanted to do good things with it, or did that come later?
Probably came later. My parents didn't have money, but my mother was very involved in some volunteer kinds of things. And I like to remind people that philanthropy is a derivative of an ancient Greek word that means loving humanity. It doesn't mean rich people writing checks. So you can love humanity by giving your time, which is what my mother gave, or energy or ideas. If you have money, you can do that too. When I realized I'd made more money than I really needed to spend on my lifestyle, my family's lifestyle, I began to realize I should do something more significant than just buying more homes or artwork or something like that. So I began to focus on what I should do philanthropically. And then Bill Gates came to me, had lunch in my office around that time, and he said he was going to start the Giving Pledge. Would I sign it? And I said, you're going to give away half your wealth, at least half your wealth, and I agreed to do that. And so there were 40 of us who initially signed it. Now there are about 200 of it. And I find the same situation that many other people have who got lucky. If you have a fair amount of money, what are you going to do with it? Well, you can do what the ancient pharaohs did. You can build a pyramid, and you can take all your wealth and be buried with it, but there's no evidence you really need it in the afterlife. So if you eliminate that possibility, you can do what most people do with most of their wealth throughout the course of history, and that is give it to your spouse and or your children. There's no evidence that you give each child $1 billion, that child is going to become a Nobel Prize winner, because people that inherit staggering sums don't usually go on to do great things. They can, but it's not necessary they have that much money to have a successful life. So if you say you're not going to give all your money to your family, then what are you going to do with it? Well, you can give it away to good organizations and causes. upon your death. And again, most people who give it away to organizations and causes wait until their death for whatever reason. They think they're going to be in a place where they'll see what their executor is doing. I wasn't sure I would see what my executor was doing, so I decided to do it while I'm alive. And you know, it's trite to say, and people laugh at it. It's not as easy to give it away intelligently as you might think. It's easy, yeah. I can give away $1 billion tomorrow, but if you want to do it intelligently and have some impact, it takes some time and effort and so forth. So I've been trying to find good things that I can do with the money, and that's what I've been trying to do.
You mentioned your children. How did they react to the fact that when you said to them, "You're going to get some, but you may get a lot less than you thought you were going to"?
They haven't complained so far. I don't know what they're saying privately, but look, the best thing you can do for your children is be a role model. And I tried to be a role model by trying to work hard and give back to society, and that's what they're doing. And I'm now trying to involve them in some philanthropic things so that as they get their feet on the ground professionally, I want them to be involved as well in philanthropy, because that's an important part of life for them, and it will be an important part of making their life much more whole and beneficial to society than it would otherwise be.
You mentioned that you try to give intelligently.
Right.
You must get dozens, if not scores, of requests every single day. I was once quoted in a newspaper article saying something nice about you, and I got at least 20 people calling me to asking if I would ask you to give them money for their good causes. So I can only imagine what it's like to be you.
Well, imagine what it's like for Bill Gates or Jeff Bezos. Those people have extraordinary sums of money. I'll never get to that level. I get roughly about $50 million of serious requests a month, of serious requests. I get lots of things over the transom that are not serious, but from people that I respect and people that I know, roughly $50 million a month. And it's hard to honor all those requests. So I've done what most people do who in my situation, but a little different. I don't have a staff, I don't have a foundation, I just write the checks for the things that I think are important. And I try to stay involved in the organizations, but I try not to just write a check and then say, do the best you can. I try to stay involved, if I can, by serving on the board or do other things. But most people who have a fair amount of money, what they ultimately do when they give it away is they give it to educational institutions, medical research, cultural institutions, things like that. And that's where the bulk of my money has gone, education, K-12 or higher education or medical research or cultural things like the Kennedy Center and other kinds of cultural organizations. A small sliver of it has gone to what I call patriotic philanthropy, but it gets disproportionate amount of attention because nobody else is doing it really that much.
And I'm going to ask you about that, but since we are here in the Kennedy Center, I wanted to ask you, you've devoted not just your money, but a lot of your time, your personality toward this place. Why?
Well, there are a couple of reasons. One, when I was in the 6th grade, I watched John Kennedy's great inaugural address. Some of you may remember that. It was only 14 minutes. It inspired many people in my generation to want to go into public service. And my teacher went through it word for word with our class, and I realized it was poetry in prose form, and I always thought that I should try to do something to help my country and give back to society. And ultimately, I went to work for the man who helped to write that speech with President Kennedy, with Ted Sorensen, and that inspired me to want to come to Washington and do things. So this is named after him, and it's a living memorial to him, so that was one factor. Secondly, I enjoy the cultural arts because culture and the kind of performing arts that we do here in arts education makes people happy. And it's important, I think, that people have some happiness in their life, and people don't come here and say, I'm really sad, I went to see a show at the Kennedy Center, I hate having done that, but I feel bad that I had to go do that. People love this, and so in a city where we're divided from time to time, it's good that you can have people come together and be apolitical and see something like this. And third, what is life all about? Why are we here? What's the purpose of life? Nobody really knows the answers to those questions. But surely it's to advance humanity and advance civilization. And one of the ways we do that is allow the brain to exercise itself, so to let people write plays, write operas, write symphonies, perform operas, perform symphonies, perform ballets. And you can see the apogee of the human experience by coming here and say, wow, look what humankind has done. We've been on this earth, humankind, Homo sapiens, for roughly 400,000 years. And look what we've achieved, and hopefully will inspire people for another couple 100,000 years to do great things. So it kind of makes me realize what wonderful things it is that humans have been able to do. When you think about it, there are 10 million species on the face of the earth. We're only one species. It wasn't evident when we came out of caves 400,000 years ago that we were going to conquer the earth. I'm sure the gorillas were looking at us to say, hey, these people aren't that really strong. The lions were saying they can't go that fast. The elephants were saying we're not that big. But because the human brain is so well developed, and it's the most amazing thing that God or evolution ever created, it's enabled us to create things that really inspire people. And one of the great places you can see the great work of the human brain is in performing arts organizations. And so it's a really wonderful way to think about what humankind has achieved. And that's what the Kennedy Center does.
I've watched you for years, and I have to tell you that when you first started public speaking here at the Kennedy Center, you were a little serious and a little stiff,
Right.
and now you're not.
Yes.
What did you do? How did you, you're always funny privately, but you decided to just let it go?
Well, public speaking is something that, like performing in, let's say you're an opera singer, you're a ballet dancer, you're a violin player. You do more of it, you get better at it. So as I learned how to be a more effective public speaker, I felt more self-confident and therefore could let my hair down a bit and use humor as a way to maybe get people to be interested. I think humor does work, and so self-deprecating humor can work as well. And obviously the best practitioner of that in recent times was John Kennedy. It takes a certain amount of self-confidence to be able to do it, but John Kennedy did it very well, and I guess I picked up some, not on him, but I picked up the sense of self-deprecating humor and using humor, and sometimes it works. Sometimes if you make a joke, it doesn't work. It's not as much fun, but so I try to do it from time to time. And again, what I did is when I started getting invited to make speeches, I would accept every invitation. The more I practiced as a speaker, I would get better at it, and eventually it worked out okay for me.
You didn't get like a coach or a joke writer or any of that stuff?
No, not yet, but maybe.
Look, we're going to move on to the book, but I have to ask you something important involving you happened this week. David, as everybody probably here knows, funds the Panda Project at the National Zoo, and I was a little worried when I heard they were sending back Bebe, and I wondered how you're doing.
Well, for those who don't know about it, I'll just explain what happens. When, again, as I said, there are 10 million species on the face of the earth. The most popular of the 10 million is probably the pandas. And there are 7.5 billion of us, humans, but there are only 1,600 pandas. Now, why are there so few pandas? Well, for a number of reasons. They are only native to one part of the world, northern China. The development in parts of northern China has taken away their natural habitat. There's poaching of pandas. But also, pandas have the most unique reproduction method of any mammal. The female goes into estrus and more or less can reproduce only for 4 hours a day, 1 day a year. So think about how few people there would be if people could reproduce only 4 hours a day, 1 day a year. So it's a very complicated process. And what happens in the wild is they kind of signal each other. They'll be ready in the appointed hour. They get together. But because they do it so infrequently, the parts don't go where they're supposed to go because they don't know where they're supposed to put the parts. So it doesn't really work. In captivity, they show movies to the pandas of what they're supposed to do. It's called panda porn. They show the movies. But the panda's eyesight is not as good, apparently, as, or it doesn't have the same effect as it does on humans. So they look at it, but doesn't really give them much of an idea. So in captivity, what we do is we put them together for the appointed 4-hour period of time, and then they fumble for 2 hours, and then you separate them, and they say, we're going to artificially inseminate them. And because I've been involved in helping to fund some of this, they wanted to know whether I wanted to see the artificial insemination occur. I said no. They said, you want to see the semen extracted from the male? I know I don't want to see that. So, what happens is there are 27 zoos in the world that now rent pandas from the Chinese effectively for $1 million a year, and that money is used to help with panda research in terms of how to help them reproduce better. When a panda is raised at the age of 3, in the wild they leave the mother, and the pandas live alone. They don't live like lions or elephants together. In the zoo here, when a panda reaches 3, under the agreement with the Chinese, we have to send the panda back. And the reason is this. That panda ultimately will want to mate with somebody else, but if it's mating with its siblings, it's not going to work. So they have to send it back to somebody that can genetically, they can reproduce with. And so ultimately, we hope we'll have more pandas produced here. The pandas we currently have now, the female might be able to produce one more year. We're not 100% certain, but hopefully we'll have some more babies sometime soon.
You're surprisingly unsentimental about this.
Well, I'm as sentimental as the pandas are.
You know, you mentioned patriotic philanthropy. Obviously, we're also grateful about the restoration of the Washington Monument. It might not be done yet were it not for you. The Montpellier's underway. You have bought these documents. What got you interested in what is called patriotic philanthropy?
Well, let me try to explain. If I had said to McKinsey or BCG or Bain, look, I want to give back to my country in more ways than one traditionally does by funding things that, medical research or education, they might have come up with a good idea, but that didn't happen. Like most things in life that are really great, very often they happen by serendipity and not planned. So I happened to be invited to a viewing of the Magna Carta in London. I mean, I was flying back from London. It was in New York. It was a viewing in New York. And so I said, okay, I'll bite. Why is the Magna Carta in New York? I thought it was in London. So I go to this screening, and it's at or viewing at Sotheby's, and they told me that there are 17 copies of Magna Carta, 15 in British institutions, 1 in the Australian Parliament, but 1 Ross Perot had bought in the early 1980s. He was putting up for sale. It's the only one in private hands. And it was going to be sold, and the curator told me, maybe to lead me on or not, I don't know, that it would probably leave the country. Probably the leading buyers were from Russia, South Africa, and a Middle East country. And so I thought one of the 17 should stay here because it was the inspiration for the Declaration of Independence. All of our colonies had, in their charters, they said that we have the rights of Englishmen when the charters were set up, and they then thought that meant the rights of the Magna Carta, which meant no taxation without representation, among other things. So I decided to buy it, and I went back the next night. I didn't want to tell anybody. It sounds presumptuous to say I'm going to go buy the Magna Carta. So I went back the next night. I did buy it, and then I put it on what I call a permanent loan to the National Archives. And then it got into the habit of realizing that it would be a good idea to have other historic documents like the Declaration of Independence or the 13th Amendment, the Emancipation Proclamation, put on display as well. And this is the reason. The human brain has not yet evolved so much so, and it may in 100 years or maybe less, so that if you go to see the Magna Carta on a computer screen, you'll have the same experience as if you see it in person. Because if you see it in person before you go or after you go, you're likely to want to read more about it. And if you read more about it, you'll know more about it, and hopefully it'll produce more informed citizenry. And so I began to buy these documents and put them on display so people could see them. And then when the Washington Monument had its earthquake damage, I asked the head of the Park Service how long it would take to fix it. He said, well, I had to get money from Congress, take a couple of years. And I said, forget the Congress, I'll put up the money. And then ultimately Congress said, well, we want some credit for doing something good, so they wanted to put up half the money. But ultimately, I got in the habit of realizing that if you can fix up the Washington Monument, Monticello, Arlington House, or other things, more people will visit it. So why is this important? This is the key thing. We don't teach history or civics as much as we used to, and as a result, we don't know as much about our history as we should. There's a famous Harvard historian, philosopher, who once said, George Santayana, those people that don't remember history are condemned to relive it. In other words, if you don't know about the mistakes you made in the past, you'll probably make them again. So if civilization is to advance, we should learn from the past. But because we worry about STEM, as we should, we don't have many civics courses as much anymore or history courses anymore. So recent surveys have shown these amazing things, that 3/4 of Americans cannot name the 3 branches of government. 1/3 of Americans cannot even name 1 branch of government. It turns out, amazingly, that 10% of college graduates believe that Judge Judy is a member of the United States Supreme Court, which is not yet the case. And recently, is there any naturalized citizen in this audience? Anybody a naturalized American citizen? Okay. If to be a naturalized American citizen, it used to be you had to live in this country 14 years. Now it's 5 years, and then you take a citizenship test. More or less, it has 100 questions. You have to pass 60 of them. You pass 60 out of the 100, and the questions are like, who was the first president of the United States, things like that. They're not that difficult. 91% of naturalized citizens, presumably naturalized citizen candidates, 91% take that test. Presumably with some study, they passed, 91%. The same test was given by the Woodrow Wilson Foundation recently to native-born citizens in all 50 states, and a majority of citizens failed that test in 49 out of 50 states. Only Vermont did a majority of citizens actually pass it, which shows that we don't know that much about history. So part of what I'm trying to do in my little area is to get people to know a little bit more about history and civics and more about our government. And that's what led to the book, really.
So, of course, the book is a series of interviews. And, you know, I have to say, when I found out that along with all the other things that you were doing, you had decided to start doing high-profile interviews, I was a little alarmed. I mean, like, there are people like me, that's all we do, that's all we can do. Well, why are you doing that too?
Well, you're doing it better than me.
No,
So,
I don't think so.
what happened was this. At Carlisle, we used to have prominent people come in, former presidents of the United States and former secretaries of state, who were draws to bring investors to our conferences, because nobody wanted to hear Rubenstein 20 years ago or 25 years ago. They may not want to hear me now, but they certainly want to hear me then. So I would hire these people, and we pay them their fee, and they would come in, and they were not all that scintillating as speakers. So eventually I said, for the fee I'm paying, maybe I should get more bang for the buck. So I said, why don't I interview these people? I can make it a little bit more interesting. And the people said, well, is the same fee? Yes, same fee. Okay, then we'll do it. So I started interviewing them. And then what happened was I got some sense I could do some of the interviews, make it a little humorous. And then Vernon Jordan came to me and said, I want you to replace me as the president of the Economic Club of Washington. I said, what is the Economic Club of Washington? I don't know. He said, well, it's a couple, 100 or 200 business people. They meet once a quarter, and you just get a business person, bring them up, let them speak, get questions from the members, read the questions, you're done. Okay? So I did it. Vernon's very persuasive. And so the business people were speaking, and they weren't any better than the politicians I was hiring. So I eventually got questions from the audience, and the questions from the audience were terrible too. So I pretending I was reading the questions from the audience, and I was making them up as I went along, and they were funnier, so it kept the audience lively. So eventually I went to an interview format. And so I got comfortable at doing it, and then what happened was Bloomberg came to me, and they saw the interviews I was doing, and they said, why don't you do a TV show? And I said, well, okay, I can do that. I try. And I said, what are you going to call it? They said, we're going to call it the David Rubenstein Show. And I said, wait a second, a long Jewish name is not going to work. And Mike Bloomberg said, no, I think it'll be okay. So, so I started that. And then this program came about for this. Let me explain what this is. About 6 years
Wait, I have a question
Go ahead.
before you start on that, because I think it's fair to say, David, that when you call, especially the business people, you know, you call Bill Gates and you get them on the phone, they don't say no to you.
They can say no.
Do they ever?
Well, some people are, you can't get everybody, but generally, if they're coming through Washington, they usually come through, and so eventually we'll do it. And my interviews are not designed they're not 60-minute interviews. I say to people, I'm not a journalist. My job is not to kind of do what journalists do. What journalists do is different what I'm doing. I'm providing them a platform, make it relatively easy for them, so I'm not a journalist, and I make it clear that. But generally, people seem to like it, and the humor sometimes works. So this came about because I thought it would be
This lecture series that the book is based on.
Is this. I am
Interview series. Sorry.
interested in history, as I mentioned. I love books, and it came about this way. I got involved with the National Book Festival, which next year will be its 20th anniversary. It was started by Jim Billington, now Carla Hayden, the Library of Congress continues. We get 200,000 people a year coming. We do it typically one day at the Washington Convention Center, and it's free for everybody that comes, and we have about 145 authors. They're interviewed, they sign books, and so forth. And I've been interviewing authors there for a while, and I thought I could be comfortable in interviewing authors in front of a different type of audience, and here's what it was. I thought it'd be good if members of Congress would know as much about history as maybe we would want them to know as our elected representatives. So I started a program about 6 years ago where I would interview a great historian about his or her most recent book, usually about a great American, and I would do it at the Library of Congress in front of members of Congress. And the members of Congress, the theory was they would come, they would see artifacts from the period of time that the author had written the book, and then they would have a reception, and then they would come and have dinner. And I said, I'd like you to sit with people from the opposite party, opposite house, because they don't really get a chance to do that. It's not considered really good today to be socializing publicly with people from the opposite party, the opposite house that much. So they thought it would be okay if they did it. No press would be there. And so we've now done about 50 of them.
I know, I've never been to one.
Well, we don't want press there. So we've had 50 of them now over the course of the last 6 years. We just did one last week with Danielle Allen on the Declaration of Independence. The members say, this is good or bad, I'm not sure. This is the most interesting thing they're doing in Congress is going to these dinners. So, which is, I don't know if that's good or bad, but members like it because they get a chance to hear from the great historians about our country, and they are interested in history as much as any citizen because they are involved in politics and government and so forth, and so they bring their dog-eared copies of the books by the authors, and they want them autographed just like anybody else would, and they get to see these authors, in many cases, for the first time. So it's worked out pretty well, and I took about 18 or so of these interviews and distilled them and then edited them and then put them into this book.
You have really, there's so many great segments of the book, and I can't even describe all of them, but some of the figures that are in the book, the historical figures, there have been dozens of books written about these people, and some of the choices you make of the historians are obvious. I mean, talking to David McCullough about John Adams, Doris Kearns Goodwin about Abraham Lincoln, Taylor Branch on Martin Luther King, Robert Carroll on LBJ. But for some of the others, there are many different authors. How do you decide who you're going to ask?
Well, we have to do a couple things. We have to find somebody who's willing to come. 2, we have to find a date that works for Congress, for the author, and for me. Then we want to have people who will be a draw. You don't want to have somebody that nobody want to hear. And then, of course, the names you just mentioned are among the most famous American historians and so forth. And so that's how we do it. And we want to have a balance between male and female and other diversity in terms of the authors. So we try to have a balance. And it's not perfect, but we try to do that. And, I did invite, and for this book, I had one person who was not an author. Because I serve as the chairman of the executive committee of the Smithsonian, I've gotten to meet and spend time with the chancellor of the Smithsonian, who is, under law, the Chief Justice of the United States. And so I asked John Roberts if he would let me interview him in front of this audience, because members of Congress really don't know the Chief Justice of the United States that well. Their offices are just a couple hundred yards apart, but members of Congress aren't running over to the Supreme Court, and members of the Supreme Court are not running over to Congress, so they don't really know him that well, other than they've seen him socially and occasionally. So he said fine, he would do it, and so I interviewed him, and at the beginning I said, did you always want to be Chief Justice of the United States when you were growing up? He said, no, I had no interest in that. Well, did you ever want to be just a regular Associate Justice of the Supreme Court? No, no interest in that. Well, did you want to be a judge? No, no interest in that. Well, did you want to be a lawyer? No interest in that. Well, what did you want to be when you were growing up? I only wanted to be a historian. I loved American history. I told my father that's what I want to do. And my father said, John, it's nice, but nobody will read any of the things you write. You'll spend all your time in your library, and you won't be able to support your family. You won't make any money as a historian. John said, I don't care. That's all I want to be as a historian. His father said, okay, John, but remember, you're not going to be able to really make a great living out of it. John said, I don't care. He goes to Harvard, majors in history. He comes back from spring break on his sophomore year, gets off the plane at Logan Airport, gets in the cab, and says to the cab driver, please take me to Cambridge. Cab driver says, are you a student at Harvard? Yes, I am. What are you majoring in? I'm majoring in history. Cab driver said, well, when I was a student at Harvard, that's what I majored in also. He went to law school. Kind of thought maybe his father had a good idea.
You've been at it for 6 years now, right. Done a lot of these interviews. Is there one overarching thing that you've come to realize from doing these interviews about great figures?
Well, great figures, great presidents all have their pluses and minuses. The greatest American of all, in my view, and the greatest president was Abraham Lincoln, but he had his warts and his problems and challenges just like everybody else. And so George Washington, the same. They all had their pluses and minuses. But I think when you go through this book, and this book is really a series of interviews, if you really want to read a textbook on American history, there are an enormous number of great ones. And there's a great book out that's like a textbook now. I've recently interviewed the author named Jill Lepore, who's written a 900-page book on American history, the first definitive, comprehensive textbook of America written by a woman. And it's a terrific book. But this is different. This is a series of interviews. Each one can be read separately. It takes you through the span of American history from George Washington through Ronald Reagan. It doesn't include everybody, but has a few non-presidents like Martin Luther King or Charles Lindbergh. And it gives you a sense of how great some of these figures were, how many mistakes they may have made, but also how terrific the authors were who spent so many years of their life learning about these people. So typically, Doris Kearns Goodwin, the famous book on Lincoln, was 10 years in the making. Charles Lindbergh's book, written by Scott Berg, was 10 years in the making. And Charles Lindbergh was at one point the most famous person on the history of the earth for this reason. Prophet Muhammad, Jesus Christ, Abraham Lincoln, all prominent people who lived on the earth, but there was no electronic communication about what they were doing all over the world at one time. It really didn't happen until the late 1920s. The world was linked electronically. So when Lindbergh lands in Bourget Field, the whole world knows about it within a minute or two, and therefore he became the most famous person ever, the author would say. Scott Berg, who spent 10 years of his life researching it, and he wrote this terrific book. In 1999, it won the Pulitzer Prize. And he's, spent 10 years of life. He wants to do something else. He knows everything about Lindbergh, the pluses, the minuses, and so forth. And then he gets a letter from somebody saying, well, your book isn't really that complete. You didn't have something in there you should have had. Meet with me, I'll tell you what you missed. And he gets a lot of letters like this from time to time, and he said, geez, I'm not sure. But he just had a hunch that he should meet the person. He met the person and said, well, one of the mistakes you made in your book is you didn't have anything about me. Charles Lindbergh fathered 7 children out of wedlock with 3 German women, and I'm one of the children. And how come you didn't write about us? And he was stunned that he spent all this time, 10 years, learning everything about Lindbergh, and it turned out Lindbergh was able to hide from his children in the United States, his wife, that he had these 7 children from 3 German women, 2 of whom were sisters, and they didn't know they were having an affair with Lindbergh at the same time. So, history always, I guess, in his paperback edition, it'll be amended.
So, so you've learned that the story's never over.
It's never over, but it's interesting, and learning about humans that are famous, some of their pluses and minuses, I think it shows you that we have historic figures who are not perfect, just as we make fun of some of our politicians today and for their foibles and their weaknesses. The same thing happened years ago, and if you go through Thomas Jefferson's life, George Washington's life, the life of any of our great leaders, you'll find this is to be the case.
There's a lot about character in this book, and FDR, for example, I learned that Jay Winnick told you that FDR was sure as a young man that he was destined for greatness. Do you think many of the figures in the book felt that about themselves?
Well, in FDR's case, he was an only child, and so many only children think that they're destined for greatness. He did have a name called Roosevelt, and his relative had been president of the United States. His mother doted on him, and she doted on him so much so that when he got married to Eleanor, the wedding gift that Sarah Delano Roosevelt gave to her son was a house in New York, but she bought the house next door and carved a door in between so she could go back and forth between her house. Not a great way to have your marriage start, probably. So she was a doting mother, and there was no doubt that she thought he could be president of the United States. Now, he was not considered a great genius, not a great leader, and then he came down with polio, which many people thought would end his career, but then obviously he resurfaced and became one of our great presidents.
There's also a lot in the book about how people struggle to do the right thing. And George Washington, for example, is discussed that he didn't want to be involved in the forming of the Constitution because he knew he was going to be the leader of the country, and he didn't want it to look like he tried to accrue power to himself. David McCullough talked to you and said that people these days don't talk or think about the idea of honor. He says nobody talks about honor. Not money, not power, not honor. And I wondered, we don't see much of that anymore. Do you think that matters? And is there a lesson here for us that honor is something we should care about?
Well, we should care about it, but remember, while we look back on these people, they had their critics at the time, and they had the kind of criticism and fights that today would look mild, what we see today. I mean, there were times when on the floor of the Congress where people were hitting each other, hitting them with clubs and fighting physically on the floor of Congress. We have problems today, but during the Civil War, we lost 600,000 men and women, mostly men, than in combat and through other kinds of things. So 3% of our population was lost. 3% of our population today would be the equivalent of 9 or 10 million people. So we've been through tragic situations, and we've come through it. We've made some mistakes. Obviously, the birth defect of this country was slavery, and in the Declaration of Independence, they didn't deal with it. The Constitution didn't deal with it, and we're still obviously dealing with that birth defect. And Lincoln made some progress, but we still had many, many years after that to make the kind of progress we've made, though we're still a long way from where we should be.
When you see, though, the exemplary behavior of some of these figures, people trying to make sure that they're sealed off from getting a personal advantage, you can't help but compare what's going on today. And, what about that? How are we to take that?
Well, whenever you're in a moment, you always think this is the worst of times, and this is a challenge that we can't possibly get through. People have thought that before, and I'm sure we'll get through this particular challenge. And I should mention as well that one of the people that I interviewed was Cokie Roberts, who passed away sadly a few months ago. And as she liked to remind me, and did in the interview, we called it history, H-I-S story, because it was mostly men writing about men. And she did an incredible job of writing 3 books to show that women were very influential at the beginning of our country, during the Revolutionary War, and during the Civil War. And she explained how the women would write these letters to their husbands, and they gave their husbands ideas that maybe their husband should have pursued. And really, it was hard to believe in the time of the Revolutionary War, for example, women were not allowed, of course, not to vote. They couldn't serve in government. They couldn't even own property if they were married in their own name. And then Cokie likes to point out examples where John Adams is away at the Continental Congress. His house is being nearly invaded by the British, and he just writes a letter to his wife, said, just take the kids and go into the forest for a while and you'll be okay. I mean, things like that. Or Benjamin Franklin is telling his common law wife in Philadelphia, while he's living with his common law wife in London, keeps sending the money over, and when he hears his common law wife is about to die in Philadelphia, he doesn't go back and even see her. And she was pointing out that the men weren't such wonderful husbands and people, even though we honor them in great many ways. I would say that Cokie really did a great service to the country by going through the letters, which are extensive, by these women who are parts of our country's history. And one a good example about how women, I think, made a difference is John Adams and Abigail Adams had 1,000 letters between them. And Abigail Adams would send a famous letter to John Adams, say, remember the women. And John Adams never did. He didn't take it that seriously. But eventually, the women had more impact on the men than they cared to say publicly, and they had some, obviously beneficial impact. David?
Nice deflection of the
Yes.
question.
Okay.
That's just nicely done, right? I'm sorry.
Well, I would
just
say
giving you
David
idea.
McCullough is an example of somebody that when I say in the book that he was getting an award, and he got up to get this award in front of 1,000 people, and I think it was an award. Jackie, you were there. It was in New York at the American Prairie Reserve event, and instead of getting the award and just saying, "Hey, I deserve this award," he basically said, "Well, let me talk about my wife." And my wife is the person responsible for my success. My wife deserves this award. My wife does this. And I was thinking, how many men getting an award are going to talk about how their wife really deserves the award? And he told a story then as well that he's told other times. And the essence of it was that what he does with his wife in terms of writing is very unique. He will write a paragraph, and then his wife will read it to him. And he wants to make sure it sounds the way he thinks it should sound. So they do this, been doing this for 50 plus years, and she's the indispensable partner. So one time they're doing this, and he writes a paragraph, gives it to her, she reads it, and he's saying, "I think it's okay." No, she said, "No, I don't think that one sentence works." He said, "Read it again." "No, it's okay." She said, "No, I don't think that one sentence really works." He said, "Read it one more time." "No, it's okay." She said, "It doesn't really work." "God damn it, it works. Leave it alone." Okay. So the book comes out, it's a bestseller. Gore Vidal writes a review, said, "This is a spectacular book. This is one of the best books I've ever written. However, there's one sentence in that that just doesn't make any sense."
But in fact, Cokie's kind of the
Right.
only woman in the book. Is that just because there aren't many women historians?
No, not the only woman. We we've had many more interviews by women. For a number of reasons, if this book sells, we'll have a second volume with more. There was a transcript of one that we didn't quite work. We couldn't get the transcript to work, but it was a woman I interviewed who was a leading African-American scholar at Harvard Law School, and she wrote the Pulitzer Prize-winning book, and we're working on getting the transcript for the next volume. It's Annette Gordon Reed. And Annette Gordon Reed wrote the definitive book on Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings, and it's called The Hemings of Monticello. And just to digress for one moment, this is one of the great mysteries there are two great mysteries with Thomas Jefferson. How could he have written all men are created equal when he had slaves with him and he had more than several hundred slaves? Obviously, different interpretations of what he really meant. But secondly, what was the nature of this relationship with Sally Hemings? Was it rape? Was it love affair? Was it coercion? Because he'd had a relationship for 30 years with her. When Thomas Jefferson's wife was dying, on her deathbed, she said, I had a stepmother. Please promise me you'll never marry again so our two daughters won't have a stepmother. So what's he supposed to say? Yes, I won't get married again. So he didn't. And so he ultimately, when he became ambassador to France, he went over and took one of the two remaining daughters they had with him. Later, he asked for his other daughter, who was too young to originally come over, to be brought over. She comes over at the age of 9. She's brought over by Sally Hemings. And Sally Hemings is then 16 years old. I should point out the age of consent in Virginia then was 12, up from 10. The age of consent was 12, so seeing a 16-year-old woman didn't strike him. It was different than let's say, an 18-year-old woman or something. So he sees this woman, and why does he fall in love with her and then have an affair with her for 30 years, or whatever you want to call it, and he has 6 children with her, 4 of whom live? Well, one of the reasons might be this. Sally Hemings had the same father as Thomas Jefferson's wife. In other words, Thomas Jefferson's wife, Martha, was fathered by a man named John Wayles, W-A-Y-L-E-S, who was a slave owner. And many slave owners in those days would impregnate their slaves. Well, one of the slaves he impregnated was Sally Hemings' mother. So when he saw a 16-year-old, 7/8 white Sally Hemings, many people thought, he was seeing his wife as a 16-year-old, and he fell in love with her.
But that didn't make it in the book because?
Well, the transcript wasn't working for that particular thing. We're trying to reconstruct the transcript. But we have...
So there's going to be a sequel. This is
if
news.
If this book
Is there gonna
sells,
be a sequel?
if this book sells, it may be a sequel. I don't know. But I just interviewed another terrific woman who will hopefully be in the next volume as well. There's a woman named Danielle Allen about the Declaration of Independence, one of the leading scholars. We did that just last week.
Most of the people that are in the book are really exemplary in one way or another. But you did interview Bob Woodward on President Nixon. And I was thinking as I was reading it that it was such a different time then. And I wondered if you thought, there was no cable outlet devoted to protecting him. He didn't have the ability to mobilize people on social media. Do you think in this environment, given our world today and what you know about Nixon and the resignation, that maybe he would have been able to avoid resigning?
Well, Bob Woodward, as all of you know, was then only, I think, 28 years old, 29 years old. He happened to be in the office on Saturday when the editor came in and said there's a break-in, and why don't you cover it with this other guy, Carl Bernstein. And then they obviously made history by doing the research and doing the journalism that they did. Bob has now written, I think, 16 or 17 books, 12 or 13 of which have been #1 bestsellers. And
he has the same lawyer you do, too.
He's a great lawyer. His books sell a lot more than mine. I think my first printing may be a few thousand. His first printings are 2 million or something. But interestingly, Bob Woodward says in the book he never actually met Nixon. He tried many times, obviously when he was president, to meet him, but afterwards he never met him in the remaining 10 or 15 years that Nixon lived afterwards. And Bob, to answer your question, it would be different. If Nixon had burned the tapes, which he should have done if he wanted to stay in office, he would almost certainly have survived. But he wanted to keep the tapes, and that was the thing that did him in. Had there been an equivalent of Fox Network, Fox News, and social media, maybe he would have survived, but it's not clear. This is such an amazing array of people, and I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit. If you were going to have a small dinner, you and 5 of the historians or the figures in this book, who would you invite? Well, you have to say who are the most important Americans in American history, and obviously, I would say Abraham Lincoln, as I said earlier, George Washington, FDR would be three of them for sure. Teddy Roosevelt, perhaps a fourth. I think you'd probably want to have some of the prominent women in American history, which have not gotten as much attention. But meeting with Abigail Adams would be spectacular.
So I think you're there.
Well. She would
there.
have been terrific, and then also I think Martha Washington doesn't get as much credit as she deserves. And some women have done some things that are more complicated, and maybe history would be different. And I point out in the book through an interview, Mary Todd Lincoln. Think about this: Mary Todd Lincoln was very challenged in many ways, complicated, all those issues that people are familiar with. If you've seen the movie Lincoln, as she's portrayed by the Kennedy Center's honoree this year, Sally Field. It was a terrific performance. But what happened the day that Lincoln was assassinated was this. Lincoln wanted to go to see a play. He loved seeing plays. He saw more than 120 while he was president. And there was no Kennedy Center then, so entrepreneurs would set up theaters, and Mr. Ford set up Ford's Theater. There were plenty of those kind of theaters. Lincoln wanted somebody to go with him. He had a headache. He wasn't sure he should go, but it was advertised that he was going to go, so he didn't want to disappoint people. So he invited his good friend who had just been with Ulysses S. Grant, the general of the armies who had won the war. And Mrs. Grant said, uh-oh, I just saw Mrs. Lincoln a few days ago in Virginia. She was yelling and screaming at people. I don't want to be with her. So tell President Lincoln we're not going. Come up with an excuse. And they came up with an excuse that they had to go to New York to visit their son. And in fact, they went on a train to do that. So they were out of town. If Ulysses S. Grant had accompanied Abraham Lincoln with all the military that was surrounded Ulysses S. Grant, John Wilkes Booth might not have gotten into that balcony booth.
What would you, if you were interviewing Mary Todd Lincoln, what would you like to ask her?
Have you ever thought if you could have been nicer to people, how history had been different? She was challenged. Remember, in her defense, remember, she was going out with two men. One was Stephen Douglas and one was Abraham Lincoln. And she almost married Stephen Douglas. She was engaged to Abraham Lincoln. They broke it off. Then Lincoln ultimately came back and married her. And then they had two children die. I mean, the worst thing in life, without doubt, with no doubt, is burying your own child. There's nothing as bad as that, of course. She had to bury two of her children. Ultimately, three of her children died. So two of them had died when one went to the White House and one before they got to the White House. So she had lots of challenges, but that can explain it.
We're almost out of time, but I just wanted to ask you as we're closing here, and thank you all for being such a wonderful audience. Lawyer, businessman, philanthropist, master interviewer, author, father, grandfather. What's next?
Well, I hope that we can celebrate the 50th anniversary of the Kennedy Center in 2 years, and that's something we're working on with Deborah Rutter, our president. Where's Deborah? Deborah is our president. She and I are working with a lot of other people on our 50th anniversary. But, I think, I'd like, maybe I'll become, I'll try something else. Maybe I'll exercise, something I haven't done much lately. And I have a lot of exercise equipment. I might, I just walk past it by osmosis, hoping it'll work. But, so I don't know if that works, but I'll maybe get in better shape or just, I want to live longer, and so do as many things as I can. But in the end, I'm very lucky in life, and many of you are very lucky in life as well. And if you're in this room, you probably are, reasonably fortunate because, you live in a great country and probably had some prosperity in your life. And I just would end by saying I got very fortunate in some ways, but all of you should think about what you can do to make our country and our community better. All of you are probably doing something, but you can think about what you could do more than even you're doing now. And I'll just leave with a final comment that I remind people about this, that when he was sitting down to breakfast in the late 1880s, Alfred Nobel read the newspaper in Stockholm. And that morning he read, "Alfred Nobel has died." And he read his own obituary. How can you read your own obituary? What happened was fake news. It was his brother who had died. The newspaper got it wrong. So he read that merchant of death, the man who invented dynamite, has died. Thank God he's gone. And he didn't like that. So he said, I've got to do something to improve my the image of me, and he obviously came up with the Nobel Prizes. So if all of you were to be able to read your obituary tomorrow, would you be happy with it? And if you could write your obituary, what would you put in it? And would you be happy with it? And if the answer is, well, not completely, think about what more you might be able to do so that when your children, your partner, your spouse, your grandchildren, whatever it might be, your parents, when they read that obituary, and hopefully 50 or 100 years from now, they will be proud of what they have read, and what you will be proud of what people would read about you. And so I just remind you that we can all do more, and if that isn't enough incentive, think about this. There is a special place in heaven reserved for people that do more for society and country, and if you don't believe me, why would you take a chance that I'm wrong? I could be right. So think about what more you can do.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Okay? Thank you. Thank you all. Thanks for coming. Thank you all. Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed tonight's performance and that we'll see you again at the Kennedy Center Reach very soon. If you'd like to purchase additional copies of David M. Rubenstein, The American Story, Conversation with Master Historians, they can be found in the Kennedy Center gift shops. Thank you so much for coming and have a great night.